Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents The Rise and Fall of a Medieval Family, The Despensers, by Kathryn Warner, narrated by Jennifer M. Dixon. Introduction. A historian has called the Despensers one of the 14th century's most reviled families. This is perfectly true, and the Despenser story from the 13th century to the early 15th is almost impossibly dramatic. Of the 7 chief Despenser lords between 1265 and 1400, Hugh the Justiciar, Hugh the Elder, Hugh the Younger, Hugh the Younger's eldest son, Hugh, known as Hugh, Edward the Elder, Edward the Younger, and Thomas. 3 were executed, 2 died in battle, 1 probably died of plague, and only 1 died of natural causes. The Despenser men generally failed to die peacefully in their beds. They did, however, have a knack for making excellent marriages, which elevated the family's fortunes in each generation. Hugh the Justiciar, died 1265, married the heiress Aileen Bassett, and their son Hugh the Elder, died 1326, married the Earl of Warwick's daughter, Isabella Beauchamp. Hugh the Younger, died 1326, married Edward I's eldest granddaughter, Eleanor Clare, who 11 years after their wedding brought him 1/3 of her late brother's earldom of Gloucester, the greatest windfall the Despenser family ever received. Hugh, died 1349, married the Earl of Salisbury's daughter, Elizabeth Montacute. Edward the Younger, died 1375, married the heiress Elizabeth Burghersh, and their son Thomas, died 1400, made the most impressive match of all by marrying Constance of York, granddaughter of the Kings of England and Castile, and daughter of the first Duke of York. Finally, Thomas's daughter and heir, Isabella Despenser, died 1439, married 2 earls, Worcester and Warwick. These excellent Despenser marriages made the family close kin to the kings of England, yet despite this, and despite all their wealth and influence, the family came close to disaster on several occasions. Hugh the Justiciar was killed fighting against Henry III and his son, the future Edward I, in 1265, and the greed, despotism and corruption of Hugh the Younger and his father in the 1320s brought down King Edward II and almost destroyed the Despenser family as well. Thomas Despenser was summarily executed by a mob in 1400 after rebelling against the new king, Henry IV, in favour of the old one, Richard II. In other areas, at least, the picture is somewhat rosier, and the family may have been patrons of some of the greatest authors of medieval England. The poet William Langland, circa 1325 to 1330, to circa 1387 to 1400, who authored The Vision of Piers Plowman, one of the great works of medieval English literature, was the son of Eustace Stacey Rochelle, or Rochelle. Stacey himself was the son of a loyal Despenser adherent, Peter Rochelle, Under-Sheriff of Buckinghamshire in the 1320s, and an inscription in a manuscript of Piers Plowman calls William Langland the son of Stacey Rochelle, a tenant of the Lord Spencer, that is, Despenser, in the county of Oxfordshire. In 2001, a writer postulated that the Despensers were connected to the author of the great poems Gawain and the Green Knight and Pearl in the second half of the 14th century, and Isabella Despenser, Countess of Worcester and Warwick, commissioned the court poet John Lydgate, circa 1370 to circa 1450, in the late 1420s, to translate the 15 Joys of Our Lady, a devotional poem to the Virgin, from Latin into English. Lydgate dedicated his work to the worshipful Princess Isabel, now Countess of Warwick, Lady Despenser. The Despensers, the rise and fall of a medieval family, tells the story of this most fascinating of dynasties from the baronial wars of the 1260s until the 1430s, through the forced abdications of two English kings, the 100 Years' War, the Black Death, and the Great Uprising of 1381. A note on names. The Despensers were exceptionally conservative with given names, and most of the male members of the family were called Hugh or Philip. This was, unfortunately, and often extremely confusingly, the case with most noble English families of the Middle Ages. On top of all the Hugh and Philip Despensers, the father-in-law, husband, eldest son and grandson of Elizabeth Despenser, who died 1408, were all called John Arundel. The son, grandson and great-grandson of Isabella Despenser, died 1334, were all called Hugh Hastings. Isabel Despenser, died 1439, married two men called Richard Beauchamp, and Isabel had a daughter and a stepdaughter, both called Elizabeth Beauchamp, who married two Neville brothers. I have endeavoured to differentiate the many people with the same name as clearly as possible in the text, and have erred on the side of aiding the listener rather than being entirely consistent. The name Beauchamp is pronounced Beauchamp, and Bohin is Boone. The name Despenser was written Le Despenser in the Middle Ages, and female family members were called La Despenser. I have omitted the le and la, and also the de, meaning of in French, in the names of noble families such as de Clare and de Vere. I have also modernized given names, for example, Eleanor rather than the usual medieval spelling of Alienor, Philippa for Philippe, Edmund for Esmond, Joan for Johann, and so on. A note on money. A pound consisted of 20 shillings or 240 pence, and a mark was 2/3 of a pound and consisted of 13 shillings and fourpence, or 160 pence. A 14th century labourer earned about 2d per day, or around £3 per year, and the richest men in England in the 14th century, the Despenser's cousin Henry, 1st Duke of Lancaster, and his son-in-law John of Gaunt, had an annual income of about £12,000. Part 1. Rising from the Ashes. Hugh the Elder, 1261 to 1306. Chapter 1. Evesham, Worcestershire, the 4th of August, 1265. It was called a battle, but in fact it was a slaughter. Simon Montfort, Earl of Leicester, had spent over a year ruling England after defeating his brothers-in-law, King Henry III and Richard, Earl of Cornwall, and his nephew, Lord Edward, at the Battle of Lewes in Sussex in May 1264. Edward, heir to the English throne, escaped from captivity and raised an army, and on the 4th of August 1265 annihilated his uncle Simon's forces in the town of Evesham in Worcestershire. Simon himself was one of the many men killed during the battle, soon after seeing his eldest son Henry Montfort cleaved almost in half. Much of his army was cut down or wounded and taken prisoner, and his second son, Simon the Younger, arrived at the battlefield with reinforcements in time to see his father's head carried past on a spike. The great Earl of Leicester's body was mutilated and dishonoured. His head and testicles were sent to Maud, Lady Mortimer, at Wigmore Castle in Herefordshire, as a macabre gift from her husband Roger. Another man killed at the Battle of Evesham, one of Simon Montfort's closest and most loyal allies, was the Leicestershire Baron, Sir Hugh Despenser. Despenser was the son and heir of another Hugh Despenser, who was seriously ill in October 1237 when Henry III sent his physician, Master Thomas, to tend him, and who died between the 23rd of February and the 30th of May 1238. The younger Hugh was probably born in 1223 and was placed in the custody of his uncle Geoffrey Despenser after his father's death. Hugh was knighted on the 1st of January 1245, and King Henry sent him 2 casks of wine for his celebratory feast afterwards. In the 13th century, the name Despenser was often written as Dispensato or Dispensarius, and this gives a clue to the family's origins. They were the stewards or dispensers of the Earls of Chester in the 12th century and had originally come to England after the Norman conquest. Hugh Despenser was a lawyer and was appointed Justiciar of England in 1260. In April or May 1257, he had been one of the men who accompanied Henry III's brother, Richard of Cornwall, to Aachen for his coronation as King of Germany. Hugh was a long-term associate and friend of Simon Montfort, a French nobleman who arrived in England around 1230 and married Henry and Richard's sister, Eleanor, in 1238. Simon's uneasy relationship with his brother-in-law, the king, exploded into war in the 1260s after he led a group of barons who in 1258 imposed the provisions of Oxford on Henry. The provisions were a radical set of propositions which limited the executive powers of the king and made him little more than a figurehead. They were soon overturned, but during the period when he controlled the English government between May 1264 and the Battle of Evesham, 15 months later, Simon Montfort held 2 parliaments and invited representatives from the shires and towns for the first time, and is remembered today as one of the progenitors of the English Parliament. Despite his long association with Henry III and Richard of Cornwall, Hugh Despenser enthusiastically supported Montfort's reforms of Henry's government. When the papal legate in England, Montfort's countryman Guy Fouquet, soon to become Pope Clement IV, excommunicated Montfort and his followers in 1264, he named them as Simon, Earl of Leicester, Hugh Despenser, and others, their accomplices. As well as this obvious indication of Despenser's deep involvement with the Earl's reforms, Simon Montfort appointed Hugh as one of the executors of his will on the 1st of January 1259, a clear sign of his trust in Despenser. England slid slowly towards war between the Royalist party and the baronial party led by Montfort in the early 1260s. In March 1264, Hugh Despenser, then Constable of the Tower of London, led a group of rioters who attacked the Isleworth manor of Richard of Cornwall, whose coronation in Germany he had attended 7 years previously. His cousin John Despenser, son and heir of his uncle and former guardian Geoffrey, shared his allegiance to Montfort and was said to be against the king, as did a rather more distant cousin, Adam Despenser. Both John and Adam were captured by Roger Mortimer of Wigmore, a staunch ally of the king and rival of the Despensers, in 1264. Hugh Despenser married Aline Bassett, who was much his junior, born sometime in the 1240s. Her father gave the couple his Northamptonshire manor of Barnwell when they wed. Aline is likely to have been Hugh's second wife. Henry III had granted Despenser permission to marry where it shall seem best for his promotion as far back as February 1238, when he was 14 or 15, and it seems unlikely that he would have waited for as long as 20 years to do so, though the identity of his presumed first wife is not recorded. King Henry gave Despenser a cask of wine on the 12th of February 1259, which possibly reveals the date of his and Aline's wedding. Aline was one of the 2 daughters of Philip, Lord Bassett, and became her father's sole heir when her sister, Margaret Fitzjohn, died before 1271. Philip himself was the 3rd son and ultimate heir of Alan Bassett, died 1232, Lord of High Wycombe in Buckinghamshire. Philip's eldest brother Gilbert died childless in 1241, and his second brother, Fulk, died 1259, was Bishop of London. Philip Basset, Hugh Despenser, and another baron, Hugh by God, alternated the office of Justiciar of England in the first half of the 1260s. Philip was married to Aoise, daughter either of Sir Matthew Louvain or Sir Ralph Hastings, and they named one of their two daughters, Aline, after Philip's mother, Aline Gay. The Bassets owned lands in Suffolk, Cambridgeshire, Essex, Oxfordshire, Surrey, Buckinghamshire, Wiltshire and Hampshire, all of which passed to the Despenser family via Aline's marriage. Philip was a royalist baron who was badly wounded and captured at the Battle of Lewes in May 1264, fighting for Henry III and Henry's son, Edward, and brother Richard against his Despenser son-in-law and Simon Montfort. Even pro-Montfort chroniclers commented on the glory Philip won on the battlefield, and the Worcester annalist stated that Hugh Despenser tried to save his father-in-law, but Basset refused to surrender while he could still stand and received more than 20 wounds. Despite his bravery, he, with King Henry and Henry's brother and son, were captured at Lewes and held in comfortable captivity for over a year, while Montfort and his allies ruled the country. Philip's daughter, Aline, was certainly the mother of Hugh Despenser, the Justiciar's only son, Hugh the Elder, who was her and Philip's heir, as well as her husband's. Hugh the Justiciar also had daughters, Joan, Eleanor, and possibly Anne and Aoise, though it is not entirely clear whether Aline, or Hugh's unknown first wife, was their mother. Joan Despenser married Thomas Furnival and gave birth to her son, Thomas the Younger, in the early 1290s or soon before. He was aged either 40 or 40 and more in 1332, and almost certainly was Aline's child. Eleanor Despenser married Hugh Courtenay of Oakhampton, and her only son, Hugh Courtenay the Younger, Earl of Devon, was born in September 1276. Eleanor might also have been the grandmother of Richard, Lord Grey of Codnor, born in the early 1280s, via one of her daughters. Grey was addressed as dearest cousin by Hugh Despenser the Younger, born circa 1288 or 1289, Hugh the Justiciar and Aline Basset's grandson in 1324. If Eleanor did become a grandmother in the early 1280s, it is impossible that Aline Basset, who was no more than about 40 years old then, and perhaps younger, could have been her mother. William, Lord Ferrers of Groby in Leicestershire, who was born about 1240 and was the younger brother of the Earl of Derby, married a woman called Anne, stated by the complete peerage to have been Despenser the Justiciar's daughter. Their eldest child, William Ferrers, the Younger, was born in January 1271. Assuming her identification is correct, Anne seems much more likely to have been born to Hugh's first wife than to Aline. It is possible that Hugh and Aline had a daughter called Aoise, who married Ralph Basset, son and heir of Ralph Basset of Drayton in Staffordshire, an ally of Hugh Despenser, who was also killed fighting for Simon Montfort at Evesham. Ralph Basset, the son, died 1299, married a woman called Aoise, whose parentage is uncertain, but as Aline's mother was also called Aoise, it is likely that she and Hugh would have given one of their daughters this name. Basset died 1299, and Aoise had a son inevitably also named Ralph Basset, died 1343, who was addressed as dearest cousin, fair cousin, and beloved cousin in the 1320s by Hugh Despenser the Younger. Hugh also talked of the honour of you and all of us who are of your lineage in a 1324 letter to Basset. Unless Basset's mother was a Despenser, The two men would have been fifth cousins or thereabouts. The Bassets of Drayton were only rather distantly related to the Bassets of Wickham, Aline's family, a relationship which seems a little tenuous for Hugh to talk to Ralph about all of us who are of your lineage. Finally, a petition which relates to a raid on Sempringham Priory in Lincolnshire in 1312 mentions the support of Sir Hugh Despenser the Elder and his sisters, ladies in the said priory. Apparently Hugh the Justiciar had two or more daughters who became nuns, or at least retreated into a priory for a while. The man known to posterity as Hugh Despenser the Elder, his parents' only son and heir, was born on Tuesday, the 1st of March, 1261, probably at one of his father's Leicestershire manors or at one of his grandfather Philip Basset's Buckinghamshire manors. In 1275, the Leicestershire jurors at the Inquisition, post-mortem of Hugh the Justiciar's cousin, John Despenser, knew Hugh the Elder's exact age and date of birth, and in 1281, the Buckinghamshire jurors at his mother Aline's Inquisition, post-mortem, were the only ones in the 7 counties where she held lands who knew this information. 8 months after little Hugh's birth, shortly before the 11th of November 1261, Sir Matthew Levane, perhaps the father of Aoise, late wife of Philip Basset, died. If this identification is correct, Matthew was the little Hugh's maternal great-grandfather. Aoise Basset herself had died some time before November 1254, when Philip received papal permission to marry his second wife, Ella, Dowager Countess of Warwick, and a granddaughter of Henry II, who reigned 1154 to 1189, via Henry's illegitimate son, William Longaspey, Earl of Salisbury, died 1226. Ella's first husband died in 1242, and she was a first cousin of Henry III. Unusually, she retained her maiden name. Both Henry III's son, Edward, and her step-grandson, Hugh Despenser the Elder, addressed her as Ella Longaspey. Little Hugh the Elder was just 3 years old when his father fought at the Battle of Lewes in May 1264. Lord Edward, heir to the throne, escaped from his uncle Simon Montfort's captivity a few months later and raised an army against Montfort and trapped Simon and his forces in the Worcestershire town of Evesham. Hugh the Justiciar refused to abandon his friend Simon before the battle, even though Montfort supposedly begged him to flee from the town and save himself on account of his great age. This is a curious remark, given that Despenser was 15 or so years younger than Montfort, and only about 42, and the comment was probably somewhat misreported by a chronicler. Despenser replied, my lord, let it be. Today we shall all drink from one cup, just as we have in the past." Montfort's respect for Despenser's abilities is clearly revealed by his comment to the younger man shortly before the battle that "you will leave behind you hardly anyone of such great value and worth." Little is known of Hugh Despenser the Justiciar personally, but this assessment of him by one of the great men of the Middle Ages reveals that he was an immensely able and intelligent person, admired and respected by his peers. Despenser was a capable lawyer, administrator, and estate manager, and his son, Hugh the Elder, inherited his abilities and added a great talent for diplomacy to the list. Hugh the Elder's son, Hugh the Younger, was also clever and able, though in his case his intelligence and common sense came second to his almost pathological greed, which in the 1320s brought about his own destruction, his father's and King Edward II's, and came close to destroying the Despenser family. Despenser the Justiciar was literally, not metaphorically, stabbed in the back during the final stages of the Battle of Evesham. The dagger which killed him was possibly wielded by Roger Mortimer of Wigmore, the man who sent Simon Montfort's head and testicles to his wife Maud after the battle, and who had captured Despenser's cousins John and Adam in 1264. At any rate, decades later, the Justiciar's grandson, Hugh the Younger, swore revenge on Mortimer's son and grandson for his death at Evesham. The Justiciar was buried alongside Simon Montfort and Simon's son Henry before the high altar in the Abbey Church of Evesham. He left his young widow Aline at least 2 and perhaps 4 or more daughters, and his 4-year-old son and heir. Hugh had so much trust in Aline that he left her in command of the Tower of London when he went to fight at Evesham, and one chronicler commented on the inconsolable grief she felt at the loss of her husband. Chapter 2. Fortunately for Aline Despenser, her father was a friend of the king, and 2 months after Evesham, Henry III gave her the 3 Leicestershire manors, which had belonged to her husband and would ultimately pass to their son, in consideration of the service of Philip Basset. Philip died on the 29th of October, 1271, leaving his daughter as his sole heir, and Aline inherited 13 manors in 7 counties, a figure which does not include the 3rd of the Basset lands held in dower by her stepmother Aila, who outlived her by 16 years. By the time of Philip's death, Aline had married her second husband, Roger Bigod, Earl of Norfolk. Born circa 1245, he was close to her own age and was the nephew of the childless Roger Bigod, died 1270, the previous Earl of Norfolk, and the son of Hugh Bigod, who had alternated the office of Justiciar with Philip Basset and Hugh Despenser. Aline used her first husband's name throughout her second marriage. Even the Earl called his wife by the name of her previous husband, and a grant of pasture land to her in 1280 named her Lady Aline la Despenser, Countess of Norfolk. Noblewomen of the 13th and 14th centuries tended to use the name of the highest ranking of their husbands, and as an earl, Roger Bigod was of higher rank than Hugh Despenser had been. This indicates that Aline had found her first marriage a happy one and wished to honour Hugh's memory. She and Roger had no children, and Roger had no offspring from his second marriage either, and was the last of the Bigod Earls of Norfolk. Aline's son, Hugh the Elder, was 10 years old when his Basset grandfather died in 1271, and 11 when King Henry III died in November 1272, to be succeeded by his son Edward I, then 33. Edward and his Spanish wife, Leonor of Castile, were on crusade in the Holy Land and did not return to England until August 1274. Their coronation took place at Westminster Abbey that month, and 13-year-old Hugh may have attended with his mother and his stepfather, the Earl of Norfolk. One of the earliest occasions when Hugh appears on record came after the death of his father's cousin, John Despenser, in 1275, when Hugh was named as the heir to John's 3 manors, Martley, Bemina and Arnsby. He was allowed to take possession of the manors on the 3rd of March 1282, 2 days after he turned 21, and thus came of age. Hugh attended a jousting tournament in Compiègne in 1278, aged 17, and was said in a government record of 1280 wrongly to be the son and heir of John Despenser. In 1282, the king, going on campaign to North Wales, ordered Hugh to stay in England with the royal cousin Edmund, Earl of Cornwall, for the preservation of the king's peace. Also in 1282, Edward I asked Hugh to build 2 gates in his park at Barrow, Cheshire, to enable the king's carts to pass through more easily on the way to Rhuddlan, North Wales. Hugh took part in the King's Welsh Wars the following year, under the Earl of Cornwall's command. He was first summoned to Parliament in 1283, when he was 22 years old, and appears again on record on the 3rd of November 1284, when he was given permission to take 30 cartloads of wood annually from a forest in Leicestershire. As he grew up, Hugh the Elder decided to follow an entirely different career trajectory to his father, and was a loyal royal servant for all his long life, faithfully serving Edward I and his son Edward II for more than...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?